Join us and explore the historical Germany, along with the four rivers Moselle, Rhine, Main and Danube. We visit German cities with rich histories and eventful pasts. Cities with half-timbered houses and medieval fortresses. The river Moselle is the longest tributary of the Rhine and flows through one of the most beautiful landscapes in Germany. From the inconspicuous source in the Vosges and along the natural border between Luxembourg and Germany. Before long, Trier appears, the oldest city in Germany. Founded in 18 BC under the Roman Emperor Augustus, it is protected by a city wall with 5 gates. The city has lived through 5 emperors and under Constantine the Great became the center for the spread of Christianity north of the Alps. An important part of Roman life was a visit to the baths. And the Roman arena was planned as part of the city wall when it was built and could also be used as a city gate. Here, cruel battles between wild animals and gladiators took place as a form of entertainment. Having been destroyed by the Franks, the city grew when Baldwin of Luxembourg became archbishop and elector in 1248. And the electoral palace, including the magnificent garden, was extended. This splendor survived the French conquest. In the 19th century, the rear part of the archbishop's palace was used as a barracks, then later demolished, and only the Red Tower and the so-called Petrus Tower were preserved. A stroll through the old town towards the main market leads past the magnificent houses of the nobles and superiors of the church to the cathedral square. In 1227, the early Gothic Liebfrauenkirche was built to replace parts of the St. Peter Church. The 8 niches are adorned with paintings and stone reliefs, and the apostolic creeds are painted on the pillars. The Domplatz is framed by the magnificent buildings of high priests. The mighty Romanesque sacral building of St. Peter forms the western part of the twin church. A basilican longitudinal construction from the Middle Ages. The complete cathedral represents a period of art and architecture spanning more than 1,650 years. A short lane leads from the Domplatz directly to the main market, the lively center of the old town. Well-preserved townhouses still frame the market square today, and the Lion Pharmacy stands proudly as one of the oldest houses. The Franken Tower from the 1100s is the oldest residential tower, and the late Gothic town church, St. Gungolf, founded after 970, is wedged between the houses and has been redesigned several times. Still striking today are the Red House, the city's ceremonial house, and the Dreikönig House, which was built in 1230 when the city wall was still unfinished. The dark Roman city gate from the 2nd century only became known as the Porta Nigra in the Middle Ages, the Black Gate. The gate of the mightiest ancient Roman architectural style became, with the other Roman buildings, a World Cultural Heritage Site. Pretty villages, slopes overgrown with vines and lovely riverside scenery accompany the Moselle downstream. Probably every ship docks in Bernkastel, that medieval jewel with the adapted castle ruin Landshut above the village. When it gets dark, this romantic site cannot be topped. The castle, the facades of the half-timbered houses, and the church all compete for the best presentation. One of the oldest wine villages then shows off its historical marketplace, the living room of the city. It is stylishly framed by 400-year-old half-timbered houses decorated with ornaments. A public pillory and the St. Michael's fountain in front of the magnificent old town hall testify to the power and former prosperity of the city and more than 700 years of history. The Moselle meanders further downstream and suddenly Cochem appears out of the fog. In the 11th century, the Staufer built a mighty castle on the distinct hill, and the bridge was also the reason for the city's prosperity. In 1689, French troops conquered the city and the castle and burned everything down. The castle remained a ruin for almost 200 years. It was not until 1866 that a citizen of Berlin bought it and began to rebuild it in the neo-Gothic style, until the work was completed 11 years later. The valuable historical interior decoration in the style of the New Renaissance and the New Baroque fascinates the visitors. The current appearance of the castle successfully preserves the essence of the medieval building, together with Romanesque or Gothic elements. On the way from the castle down to the town, fairy tale views of the Moselle help the time pass. One can imagine oneself back in centuries past, because everything seems unchanged. Cochem is considered a tourist centre between Trier and Koblenz, and its rich history has left a very visible mark here. More than 2,000 years ago, first the Celts came, then the Romans settled, and here a declaration from the year 886 first documents a city with name Cochem. But in the Middle Ages, a larger settlement finally developed, one which received its town charter in 1332. Around 1423, a plague epidemic raged here. And in the 30 Years' War, the city was besieged but not conquered. Cochem has survived and looks like it's from a fairy tale. After about 50 kilometers further downstream, passing ever more castle ruins on both banks, the Moselle flows into the Rhine. This is Koblenz, with its fortress high above the river. In around 1000 AD, a fort was built on a knoll on the east bank of the Rhine, and thereafter Castle Echenbreitstein gradually developed. Europe's second largest fortress came to appear as we see it today between 1817 and 1828. From here, noblemen once surveyed the river valley as well as an expanding settlement, a strategic location. A cable car above the river connects the fortress with the city of Koblenz, which is situated at the strategic confluence of both the Rhine and the Moselle. On the German corner, a monument was erected to commemorate Emperor Wilhelm I. Following 3 wars, he completed the unification of Germany. Today, it is also the main station of a highly controversial modern suspension train whose construction almost brought about the withdrawal of this area's World Cultural Heritage status. The peninsula derived its name from the order of German knights who had a mansion constructed here in 1216. Each year, more than 2 million tourists come here. In St. Castor Basilica, negotiations took place which in 843 AD led to the Treaty of Verdun that clarified the division of the Frankish Empire between the 3 sons of Louis the Pious. Görres Square has been known since the year 2000 for its history column that describes the city's past in 10 scenes. Koblenz likes to be known as a city that has time to dream. From the Middle Ages to the late 18th century, Koblenz was the residence of the powerful archbishops of Trier. In 1794, the city was taken over by France, and in 1815 by Prussia. In the heart of the old city, Jesuit Square is a reminder of the homonymous order. And close by is the Schangl Fountain, with a figure of the scallywag of Koblenz. Almost within reach of a scholar of the local convent school. On the banks of the Rhine, the Prussian government building rises powerfully in neo-Romanesque style. And adjacent to it is the Electoral Palace, within which royalty once resided. This magnificent building was designed by Elector Clemens Wenceslaus in the style of early French classicism. Today, Koblenz continues to exude the impressive history of a colorful period and is the cultural center of the region of the Middle Rhine. Now the ship travels upstream along the Rhine. In the morning mist, our journey leads on Europe's both mightiest and busiest river. Passing Boppard, which originated from a Roman garrison. We travel further up the Rhine, whose source is situated in the Swiss Alps, as it gradually makes its way to the North Sea, 1,320 kilometers across Europe. The Celts called it Rhinos, the Romans Rhenus, and the Germans referred to the river as Father Rhine. It emerges here in Goa. The beautiful yet hazardous Lorelei, a thing of myth and legend. We pass by a 133-meter-high rock on a sharp bend, where the Rhine is barely 113 meters wide. Soon, the river becomes more tranquil. The craggy slopes gradually change to vineyards, and the river valley widens. Next, Oberwesel, a city of towers and wine. As can be seen, a huge defensive wall protects the entire city. However, the most powerful river in Western Europe is not only of historic interest, it is also the busiest waterway in the world. The Rhine has always been important in the history of European trade. Outside the city Kaub, the waterway narrows dramatically and reveals Pfalzgrafenstein Castle, whose lords were well versed in the levying of taxes. In the 650 years of its existence, it was never conquered. The trip continues upstream, the river valley widens and green dominates its banks. Bacharach nestles in the confluence of the Stiege Valley into the extensive Rhine Valley. The river was eventually tamed by the advent of hydraulic engineering, which brought about the end of tolls set by various lords. On the riverbanks, fishing villages came into being, often protected by the aristocracy. Craftsmen and merchants also settled here. Already in Roman times, a fort dominated the city of Bingen, and high up on the opposite bank is the huge Germania statue, situated in the midst of numerous vineyards that point the way to Rüdesheim. With only the Rhine needing to be crossed, the final destination of this section of the river is reached and already announced by the anchored ships. Rüdesheim on the Rhine. A picturesque town that possesses more visitors than residents, its sunny location being ideal for the production of splendid wines. A medieval church, wooden buildings and stately homes, and the famous Drosselgasse characterize the city. Formerly, the boatmen preferred to unload their cargo here and transport it by horse and cart downstream to Kaub. From there, it was loaded back on board. This 14th century Catholic parish church was once in poor order, but has now been restored to its original condition. The Klunkerhardshof is a late medieval half-timbered residential building of the 15th century. Much of Rüdesheim has been well preserved, and today tourism has replaced shipping as a source of income for its inhabitants. The tranquility that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe enjoyed on his visits here has given way to the busy riverboats that transport tourists to and from the Eagle Tower by the old city wall. The Middle Rhine Valley reflects the history of Europe, with cultural monuments and cultivated countryside, crowded settlements along narrow banks and various noble castles situated on rocky ledges. But the journey continues in the direction of Mainz, the capital of Rhineland-Pfalz, the mighty episcopal city where the printing press was invented. The Rhine becomes wider and calmer. The landscape seems to float along, and slowly the evening sun begins to shine. Just before Mainz, we branch into the tributary to the Main and into the night. The next morning, the Main greets us with bright colors. A long distance has been traveled, and Miltenberg is reached. On the left Main side, between Spessart and Odenwald, is one of the most beautiful half-timbered towns in Germany. In addition to beam patterns, red sandstone characterizes the facades. The Catholic St. Jacobus Church is centrally located in the city centre, below the castle. It has 3 naves and an exceptional organ. In 1237, the town was first mentioned in a document and looks back on an eventful history. As an important trading place and customs office. In particular, the stacking right granted by Emperor Charles IV let Miltenberg flourish in the Middle Ages. The town was not destroyed during the Peasant War of 1525, but it was burnt down partially a few years later during the Margrave War. When the Mainz Electorate was dissolved in 1803, Prince of Leiningen came to power. But as early as 1806, the Grand Duchy of Baden ruled, then Miltenberg became Hessian, and 1816, Bavarian. When in 1818 the Kingdom of Bavaria abolished the centuries-old customs and market rights, there was a considerable financial downturn. On top of which, its former central position no longer held because Miltenberg was now on the edge of the Kingdom of Bavaria. Now the rapid development of the town ended. Thus the medieval townscape was retained. The oldest inn and many magnificent houses have been preserved. The Würzburg and the Mainz Gate still bear witness to the former prosperity, both of which adequately protected the city at the time. But in the 30 Years' War, plunderings and pillaging did take place, and the soldiers brought in epidemics. The glorious times were over. Where the Tauber joins the Main, Wertheim is situated, which today belongs to Baden-Württemberg. Already in 1192 the castle was mentioned for the first time, a dominant weir of the Counts of Wertheim. They later subordinated the whole county to the Emperor Charles IV, and he returned the county to the Counts as a fiefdom of the Bohemian Empire. Since 1383, the Gothic Collegiate Church has housed the tombs of the Count of Wertheim family. Artistic stone carvings adorn these monuments. But the most magnificent grave is that of Ludwig II of Löwenstein-Wertheim and his wife Anna of Stolberg. Michael Kern, in particular, created these incredible works of art in 1618. The city, confined within the protective walls surrounding the small main square, and the almost oversized city tower overlooks the houses and alone by its height exudes a feeling of security. In 1363, Count Eberhard of Wertheim received the right to mint coins and thus to financially profit himself. The castle initially served as the mint, but in between, following frequent interruptions, a building of the old town was ultimately used. There are also reports of floods, like that of 1784 at a height of 8.5 meters. The journey continues south into the largest German federal state, Bavaria. The picturesque baroque town of Würzburg is located on the River Main amidst the Franconian wine region, and is dominated by the mighty Marienberg fortress. Already in the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, there were fortified settlements on the knoll on the left side of the Main. The Celts created a fortress here that subsequent rulers gradually extended. The fortress had been rebuilt and extended throughout history, and around 1200 there was already a fortified complex with a donjon and a deep well. From 1253 to 1719, the fortress was the residence of the Würzburg prince-bishops. And even during the Peasant War, Marienberg could not be taken. The fortress survived every attack. Würzburg resembles an overall European work of art, and the historical city is considered the cultural center of Unterfranken. The Mary Chapel is a Gothic church on the Lower Market Square in the centre of the old town, built by the citizens of the town around 1377. The simple interior unexpectedly holds the tombs of bishops. Above is the high nave with a cross-ribbed vault. Not far away, the inviting and beautiful red sandstone facade of the Neumünster. The impressive baroque dome dates from the 18th century, although this Romanesque basilica was already built in the 11th century. The Romanesque Cathedral St. Kilian is dedicated to the Irish monk Kilian, who came to Würzburg in 686 and died as a martyr. Baroque stucco decorates the choir with an epitaph altar and the magnificent high altar. Beyond this is the Kronos fountain at the Hofstrasse, which leads to a magnificent building. Architect Balthasar Neumann laid the foundations for this residence in 1720, one of the most important castles in Europe. The large complex with castle and garden was commissioned by two prince bishops, the brothers Johann Philipp Franz and Friedrich Karl from Schönborn. The picturesque town hall was extended several times. In the 13th century, the construction of the house and tower began, where judgment was pronounced on behalf of the bishops. And the nearby Alte Kranen is a reminder of the heyday of the city's merchants. An excursion leads us to Rothenburg ob der Tauber, a key point along the Romantic Road, and where Germany's Middle Ages have been preserved up to the present day, as witnessed by the countless visitors who come here. The origins of the city can be traced back to the 12th century. Next, a fortified city gate, the Fortress Gate. It's the city's oldest and largest gate tower, which originally contained a drawbridge. The main St. Jacob Church with the 12-messenger altar was built in High Gothic style. The old city has a long history, and the noble buildings that flank the marketplace form the vibrant centre that we see today. Around the city there are massive gates in the city wall, which on the city side still today have well-preserved additional defensive bastions. In Kitzingen, we board the cruise ship again. The Main here already seems more natural, and its banks are unspoilt. Now we reach Bamberg, a typical German city from the Middle Ages, situated at the river Regnitz, where today the fishermen's houses led to the name Little Venice. Goods were also delivered by ship to the foot of the castle hill, then lifted ashore by crane and transported to the markets. From the beginning, the most important markets, such as the Green Market, were located here. The market is located directly in front of today's St. Martin's Church, whose facade looks somewhat huge in this environment. The church was founded and built by the Jesuit order. The Old Town Hall is a particularly interesting building. The famous Gothic structure stands on piles in the middle of the river Regnitz and can only be reached from either side via bridges. Since its construction, the town hall has formed the border between mountain town and island town. The Bamberg Emperor's Cathedral at the top of the mountain district is not only the most striking building in the Old Town, but is considered one of the most important sacred buildings in the German-speaking world. The Bamberg Cathedral, consecrated in 1237, has a building style from the period of transition between Romanesque and early Gothic. In 1693, Archbishop Lothar Franz of Schönborn was elected to power and had the new residence built next to the cathedral. German history of the Middle Ages was written here, with German Pope and German Emperor. Just like ancient Rome, Bamberg was built on 7 hills, and the Cathedral Hill is considered the nucleus of the city. The 1,000-year history can be seen everywhere. But it was the beer and the special art to its brewing which also made Bamberg famous. In front of the Old Town Hall, a bridge over the Regnitz River leads to the castle of Geierswerth. And nearby is the Schiller's Place, where a theatre and a residential building are also reminiscent of another great universal artist of the German language, E.T.A. Hoffmann. This visit to the city ends at the water castle Concordia on the banks of the Regnitz. In Bamberg, the Main-Danube Channel also begins, 171 kilometers for shipping. Soon we reach Nuremberg, secret capital of German Franconia and treasure trove of the German Reich. The epitome of German romanticism and tradition. An imperial city which indeed became the city of party rallies, but which has never lost its benevolent spirit. The twin-towered St. Lawrence Church is the city's largest and artistically most important religious building. Gothic splendor within. The Pegnitz River divides the two sections of the old town with several bridges and footbridges. The historic area of Siebald has always been the domain of the city's long-established middle classes. The 19-meter-high beautiful fountain is set in a corner of the main square. The Church of Our Lady at the other end of the square is one of the city's landmarks. In the choir room of the Hall Church is the radiant Tucher altar. The Middle Ages dominates the old town, with Town Hall and Fembo House, a large and completely preserved middle-class townhouse. Built by a wealthy silk merchant, then subsequently owned by patrician families Beheim and later Fembo. Siebalde Court provides an impressive panoramic view of the Nuremberg architecture of old, and the mighty Schurstab House, including a rectory and its chapel. Named after the holy Siebald, the Siebaldist Church ranks as the most important church in Nuremberg, first mentioned in 1072. The interior has always been richly furnished with works of art from the rich merchant families. In 1971, the Toy Museum was inaugurated. It features toys from around the world, both ancient and modern. Everywhere Albrecht Dürer appears, the most important artist of the German Renaissance, famous as a painter, draftsman and copper engraver. At the foot of Castle Hill is the small Tiergartner Court. There's a Dürer hare within sight of the house that the world-famous artist inhabited until his death. It's likely that many of his most famous paintings were created here. And when he felt like it, he looked out the window, up at the castle. Then he saw its mighty walls and Sinwell Tower, and felt protected by both his city and Emperor Maximilian I. Until that time, the Holy Roman Empire had no capital city, and its rulers wandered from place to place with their entourage to hold both imperial and courtly days. The importance of Nuremberg can be highlighted by the fact that each ruler of Germany resided in its castle until 1571. Most of the castle buildings have been rebuilt, including the Night Room. A framed stone gate leads to the castle chapel, and above lies the Emperor Hall. Nuremberg is living history. At Kelheim, the canal flows into the Danube, and from there a connecting boat travels to the joining point on the Danube. The Benedictine Abbey of Weltenburg is situated here, secluded and hidden, and difficult to access. Already in 932 AD, Weltenburg came into the possession of the Bishop of Regensburg. The church is deliberately kept dim in order to accentuate the dome, side altars and high altar. And all around, angels and saints depict religious scenes. The center of the inner dome appears to open up to the sky. However, the painting deceives the eye because in reality, the wooden ceiling is flat. At the front glows the Theatrum Sacrum of the high altar. The monastery is a small, secluded world that is visited a lot today, but was once built undiscovered in the remote and wild river landscape. From the banks of the Danube, a pilgrim house leads to a small pilgrimage church. Here, the faithful pilgrim can pray in peace and engage undisturbed in soul-searching. The monastery's brewery was founded in 1050 AD and is the world's oldest brewery. "100 kilometers on is Regensburg, Germany's medieval wonder, capital of the Bavarian Oberpfalz, and also often described as Italy's most northerly city. much prized in Europe and designated by UNESCO as a unique cultural and historical monument, and also the hometown of Pope Benedict XVI. Built between 1135 and 46, the 310-metre-long Danube Bridge is a masterpiece of medieval architecture. And at the entrance to the old town, a massive city gate with tower was erected. The mighty dome of St. Peter marks the centre of the old town. The impressive Episcopal Church stands on the site of a Roman building. The facade of the cathedral tells its own story. Statues, gargoyles, reliefs, and stained glass windows depict the religious faith of medieval times. A mighty building in the style of French Gothic. Next to the cathedral is the St. Ulrich Church, which was originally the Duke's Chapel. Following the extinction of the Carolingians, Regensburg remained the residence of both emperors and kings, as well as wealthy merchants who became increasingly influential. This all augmented the city's image and its inevitable prosperity. In 1245, Emperor Friedrich II decreed that the city should govern itself, headed by a mayor, and so this free imperial city was born. In the power struggle between both emperor and church, there was another contender, the bourgeoisie, immensely rich merchants, comparable with the Fuggers. The ancient town hall is one of the oldest in southern Germany and was built in the 13th century. The city grew and numerous commercial buildings and residential areas were created. However, the eventual 30-year war did not spare Regensburg. A further 150 kilometers downstream, the Danube reaches the bishop's town of Passau and is met by the rivers Inn and Ilz. No sooner had bishops been rewarded with princely power in 1217 than they ordered the construction of the well-fortified Vester Oberhaus on a ridge opposite the old town. From there they had a fine view of the city and the Danube and could therefore observe any threat of hostilities from afar. Both spiritual and temporal power were thus secured for centuries. The prosperity of Bavaria's Venice was due to its production of wine, grain, and salt. Many churches and monasteries were built, and religious splendor was not spared. The church already ruled the lives of the inhabitants here. Also, the Jesuits built a church, and the exceptional high altar was created collectively by several artists of the time. The residence square boasts the fountain of the Wittelsbacher and the new residence. The stairwell was strongly influenced by the new residence in Würzburg. In 1783, the Diocese of Passau lost each of its Austrian territories, but its splendor remained. So also the Baroque Cathedral St. Stephen with the former monastery yard, as well as the wealth of the bourgeoisie. And the dignified town hall dominates Roman Square, close to the Danube pier. The large city hall has stucco ceilings, historic paintings and precious lead glass windows. Its Venetian appearance characterizes the image of the city. The long history of Europe, which was ever more drawn together by the bond of the great rivers, is alive everywhere here. The land was settled by then, but attacks were also carried out. Exploring Germany from 4 rivers brings about a journey into the past.